Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2018 National Forum on Education Policy. We're really excited to have so many of you here with us in our nation's capital and to have an opportunity over the next 3 days to really delve into the weeds on some of the education policy opportunities that are out there in the states. From early learning to K-12 to transitions to post-secondary and to workforce, we have plenaries or workshops or concurrent sessions on all of them. One of the things that makes it so unique about the Education Commission of the States is the representation that we have from across the country. We're actually in statute in almost every single state, which is amazing, because in today's political world, if you told me you could pass the same bill in 45 states without having it amended, it'd be an amazing feat. But for us, we have 7 commissioners in each state, and it's usually the governor, the chief state school officer, the state higher ed executive, almost always the chair of House Education and the chair of Senate Education and an early learning expert. And we're excited to have that kind of representation here with us today. But before I get started talking about just what will be going on in the next 3 days, I want to talk about some of the changes that we're going to see really quickly in the next few months. Changes in who we are as an organization here with ECS, and changes in who's making education policy decisions for our nation. The 2018 elections are like any other election. It's an off-year, non-presidential election, but it means there's a lot of governor's races. And in the last 20 years, we haven't had the potential for as many changes in education policy positions as we do right now with the 2018 elections. There are 36 governor's races that are going to be taking place, and we know automatically 16 of those governors will be new because it's either term limits or a retirement from the existing governor. And there's a lot of major positions in states, positions many of you hold in this room, that are actually appointed by the governor. Across the country, we actually have 12 of the chief state school officers who are direct appointments from the governor. And in many of those states, they will have a new governor. Across the country for state higher ed executives, 7 of them are appointed directly by their governor, and 5 of them will automatically be new because there will be a new governor of some kind. We also know that there's a lot of state board of education races that are going on, but in more than half the states, 25 plus DC, the governor appoints all or at least some of the state board of education, which has a tremendous impact on some of the decisions that that state board may make around curriculum, or if they appoint the chief, who the chief state school officer will be in that state. And we have a bunch of other elections that are going to continue to happen through November. If you think of the 99 legislative chambers, remembering that Nebraska is a unicameral legislature, we have 87 of those 99 that have elections taking place here in November. And we've seen in the last couple of elections a really quick turnover with some House and Senate members during the elections. It's not a bad thing. It's great to have new ideas, but it means there's likely to be new faces and new opinions on the education committees in your states. This matters a lot because we're in the midst of a time when we're seeing a lot of change in what states are being asked to do. The Every Student Succeeds Act and the passage of that really moved a lot of power on K-12 and decision-making back to the states. We've seen an increase with the federal government on early learning block grants. There was a hearing just this week on some of the career and tech ed funding for the federal government and how that may be block granted or given back to the states with not as many strings. And so I think it's important for us to look back and say, what's different today than when we met together last in San Diego in June of 2017? A lot's changed. When we met in June of 2017, there was not an ESSA plan that had been approved in any state. Some had submitted them, but they hadn't been approved yet. August was the first ESSA plan that actually got approved. In September, we had the rollback of DACA. Regardless of where your opinion may be on the issue, it's had significant impact for students and for schools and for how states are working through that. We've had a lot of natural disasters. I list the hurricanes on this one because they were some of the biggest, but that has a tremendous impact in how your policies are implemented and how you try to get the best possible outcomes for all of your students in the entire P20 world. We've had 3 new governors who've taken office in January of 2018, many of them becoming members of the president's cabinet, but still 3 new governors. We had the Stoneman Douglas High School incident with 17 killed students at that high school. Regardless of where you are on that issue around guns, this is a big issue that we're getting a lot of questions from each of you on. And we're going to have a whole panel discussion on that Friday about school safety. In February, we had the West Virginia teachers strike. I don't list just West Virginia. I know many other states had similar issues and discussions around funding mechanisms, but that was the one that was the longest. The issue that we've seen at the Education Commission of the states is that even where these discussions around what is the right investment for K-12, even where big increases were put in, most of those states were merely bringing their K-12 school funding up to the levels that they were at in 2008 before the recession. Now, not knowing whether that's right or wrong, I think it's important to look at and say, what is the right amount that we need to guarantee we have quality outcomes for all students across America? And the National Association of State Budget Officers released a report recently that shows that for the FY 2019 budgets, on average, states have an increase of 3.2% in spending. So there are some growth opportunities out there. And in most of your states, K-12 spending is actually close to 50 or 60% of your total state budget. But we also have a change in, I think, how states are being viewed. With more authority and empowerment from the federal government also comes more accountability. I've had multiple questions from national media who've called, and they ask me, where are the states on ESSA? Why haven't we seen better outcomes yet? ESSA was passed in December of 2015. And I think it's important for states to be thinking about how they tell their story on what they are doing and where there are successes. We've been very excited to partner with many of our peer organizations under the leadership of CCSSO to promote the States Leading the Way campaign. And I'd urge each of you to get on our website or on one of our peer organizations' websites and sign up for those weekly updates. The goal there is to be able to highlight policies in your states that are making a difference on outcomes in early learning, in K-12, in post-secondary transition, and in workforce. And there's a lot of great ideas for you to learn from as you're looking at what's next for your state. But a lot of this also comes down to what is it that we can do to help you? James Bryant Conant was the original person who thought about the need for an organization like ours. He was president of Harvard. He was also the U.S. ambassador to Germany after World War II. And we have a quote of his that is etched in glass in our walls in Denver, Colorado. And I love it because I think it's timely even today, 50 years later. Mr. Conant said that the commission is a new mechanism that may stimulate action state by state by providing the necessary information which is not available in regard to many important problems. It is a new approach to the study of those problems, an approach that places no restraint on the states, but provides what the states need to act wisely. This is what we do for you every day and want to continue to do for you as we grow. We do this in 4 major ways: through research, through reports, through counsel, and through convenings. We spend a lot of time reading all of your legislative bills. Believe it or not, we read them from the first page to the last page, and we enjoy doing what we do. But every one of those bills, we pull the education policies out of them and put it into a state policy database. I get calls every week from a governor or a legislator or a chief or a SHIO, and yes, their state is unique and their issue is special, and I mean that respectfully, but when we look at the database, there's usually 5 or 6 other states that have already tackled that very issue. They may have tackled it in a really good way with good outcomes. They may have tackled it in a way that did not succeed. Both of those are important pieces of information for you to have to do your job. We enjoy this so much that occasionally we even have omnibus appropriations parties in our office because we're excited that states like California actually pass the budget and we get to comb through every single page of it. That kind of research is what allows us to provide you with information requests. If you call us and have a need, you want to know what's trending in 3rd grade reading levels, or what are the areas that STEM needs to be looked at in middle school, or where is dual enrollment policy making a difference for a certain demographic of student, this is what we use our research for. If we don't have a paper on it, we will go and write a memo for you in 24 to 48 hours that outlines the problem, gives you the research, and highlights what states have already done. I give this same spiel everywhere I go across the country, and we urge you to use our services. Last year we did 750 of these private memos. We tend to get the question first from a legislative staff, a couple days later from the chief's office, and about 2 or 3 weeks later, if the bill is passed a chamber, from the governor's office. And it's the same question, and it's fun to watch how it transcends in the states. Last year in San Diego, I gave this speech, and one of you actually sent in a request for an information request while I was giving my speech, and we got it answered before we adjourned on Friday. We also do a significant amount of work around our reports. Last year, we issued 37 different reports across the P20 spectrum. These are not just a quick look at an issue, but usually a very deep dive into the weeds of what policy is working and highlighting 2 or 3 states that you need to be checking out. We also do a lot of 50-state comparisons. We do some where we're checking as many as 10 to 20 different policies, and we're checking them for all 50 states so that you can compare. I know most of you do not care about 45 of the states, but you have a real desire to know about the 3 or 4 that are geographically surrounding you and that one state you aspire to be, which is why we put those together for you. We do a lot of counsel across the country. I can tell you our travel has increased exponentially as we are here to serve you. We do that whether it's a state relations visit into your state to help bring our commissioners together. It's great when we're able to do that. It's always the same kind of comments, though, where the governor's staff and the legislators and the chief are all there. They know each other well, but they haven't seen each other since the governor's holiday party last year. And that's why it's important as an organization for us to help bring you together across that P20 spectrum. We do a lot of testimony in the legislature. We provide technical assistance, and we do a large number of presentations when you're doing your own convenings in your state. And I'd urge you to utilize us and take advantage of us for that reason. And finally, we do convenings like we have here today. And we're excited to have so many of you here representing all of the different education policymakers across the entire P20 spectrum. Last year in San Diego, we had 550 attendees. We also did our winter commissioners meeting, and we had 17 other major meetings that we did across the country. If you have an area where we can help you on a policy to help bring those issues forward, to convene people in your state or in multiple states, let us know. That's what we're here to serve you for. We're also excited because for the 2nd year in a row, we were named one of the top 50 nonprofits in America to work for. And I think it's a testament to our staff and their desire to truly be your education policy team. I work hard with our staff to try to ask them the question often, what is it that makes this a career and not a job? And we try to talk a lot about what are your passions. And as some of you registered for the National Forum, you realized we asked you a couple of questions. And those questions, your answers, are actually on your name tags that we have for each of you. I'd urge you to look at those and share those with others. What did you come to learn about? And what is it that you enjoy? I actually am excited that I came to learn about your needs. And I'm excited that I have the opportunity to work with each of you and to provide some additional services in the state visits that I do across the country. We're really excited about what's going to happen for the rest of this week, but we also know that we want to have a secure and safe environment for each of you. So I'm going to ask that you keep your name tags with you and wear them. We'll be checking them as you come into each of the different meetings that we have, and that's an important aspect for us to make sure that we can have the good conversations that we hope to have. We have a very good program scheduled for you over the next 3 days. We have, on Friday, a lot of major speakers who are here to talk about some very important issues. We're honored to have Dr. James Johnson with us from UNC, who is going to be speaking about the changing demographics of America. What does the demographic of your school district look like in comparison to the demographic of the voters in that area? How is that changing in America, and what do you as education policymakers need to think about? We're excited to have Frank Brogan, who was just appointed this week as the Assistant Secretary for Elementary and Secondary Education for the U.S. Department of Education, here to talk with us about school safety and the federal task force that just met earlier this week. We're also excited to have Jennifer McCormick, Superintendent of Indiana, who is going to talk to us about some innovative policies they have in school safety. Kevin Kruger, who is the president of NASPA, who is working on a lot of the higher ed campus issues and has partnered with us on issues like guns on campus and sexual assaults on campus, and will be able to give a good higher ed perspective. And Ken Trump, no relation to the president, who is a national school safety expert. He actually spoke with us at our national forum 4 years ago, when at that time we had a panel with Ken Trump and with then Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano. Tomorrow we're going to start off in the morning with Carol D'Amico from Strada, who's going to be talking about some of the work they're doing around the changing needs of workforce. And Brandon Boustede from the Gallup organization is going to be talking about polling they've been doing for the last 4 years that highlight what are the needs, and more importantly, for college graduates or adult learners who did not receive some post-secondary education, where do they see their future, and what is it that they need to be able to succeed? In the afternoon, Dr. James Heckman and Governor Phil Bryant are going to be talking about early learning trends and what policies it takes to actually guarantee that all children have an opportunity to start on an equal foundation. And Sydney Chafee, the Teacher of the Year from 2017, is going to be talking to us about her experience in the classroom and what she's been able to learn speaking across the country for the last year. And I'm excited that again this year, we have over 40 of the state Teachers of the Year here with us as a great resource for many of you to utilize. Just because you're proud of the bill you passed in 2017 doesn't mean the implementation actually made it to the point that the teacher understands what that change was. I would take advantage of the state Teachers of the Year who are with us as a great resource to figure out what is the problem they're seeing and what are some of those changes that they would hope you can actually implement. Today, I'm really excited about two of the speakers that we have following me. After John King, Michelle Weise is going to talk to us about some of the amazing changes that are happening in the workforce and where there are economic issues that we need to be thinking about as policymakers. But before her, John King is going to talk to us about what are the trends in education he's seeing and where is equity in that. John's life experience is an amazing story. He actually started as a high school social studies teacher in Puerto Rico. He was a middle school principal. He was the Secretary of Education for the state of New York, and he was the U.S. Secretary of Education. His approach as president of Ed Trust brings a very unique perspective to some of the issues that we're wrestling with as a country and issues that you're dealing with in your state. So welcome to the 2018 National Forum on Education Policy, and please join me in welcoming John King to the stage.
Hello, everybody. So it's good to be with you all. It's good to see many old friends and new friends in the room. So what I want to talk about is the current education policy landscape. And what I want to start with is acknowledging that when I was a teacher and a principal, I hated the end of the school year. Because at the end of the school year, that's a time of regret. When you look back at the school year, you think about the things that were on the to-do list that never got done. You think about the decisions you made that you wish you'd made a little bit differently. I never liked the end of the school year, but this school year has been particularly hard. And it's worth thinking back. This school year began with our kids watching images of the KKK and the Nazis marching across a college campus in Charlottesville. Jeremy talked about the rescinding of DACA, where everyone falls on the politics of immigration. Think about the experience of a kid sitting in class wondering if he will be able to go on to college or enter the workforce. Think about the kids who are worried about family members being deported. Think about the kids who experience the trauma of hurricanes, and the kids in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, places where there are still communities without water and power. Think about the trauma that that brings to a kid's life. Think about the young people who watched as African Americans had the police called on them for such egregious things as waiting for somebody at Starbucks, taking a nap in their own dorm. When I think about what that means for young people, think about the young people who've watched these images of the school shootings and the impact that that has on them, their fear about gun violence. Think about the young people in communities like Baltimore and Chicago They not only fear the violence they see in the school shootings, but fear the everyday violence that is their experience in the community. So this has been a hard school year. Let's acknowledge that. But I think about in these moments of thinking about what's hard, I think about a story Julian Bond, the civil rights activist, would tell about his grandfather. His grandfather was born into slavery, but then at 15, walked across the state of Kentucky with his steer, which then became his college tuition. He went to college at Berea College. And he would tell this story to Julian Bond, and he would say, you know, there are folks who are pessimists. And what pessimists see, they see darkness and danger in every cloud. What pessimists see is an omen of evil in every lightning bolt. But what they miss is that the cloud actually brings life and growth. What they miss is that the darkness always comes before the light. And so Julian Bond's grandfather would try to instill in him the clarity of purpose, that things can and will get better. And so that's the spirit in which I want to talk about the education policy landscape that we face. Because there are important signs of progress that we ought to celebrate. We ought to celebrate that states represented in this room have made significant investments over the last decade in early learning. There are more kids in quality pre-K today than there were last year, than 5 years ago. Tens of thousands more. States in this room have led the way in raising high school graduation rates. Last year we had the highest high school graduation rate we have ever had as a country at 84%. That's because of work folks in this room did. Over the course of the Obama administration, from the time the president took office to the time he left, we sent 1 million more African American and Latino students on to college. It's real meaningful indicators of progress. We also know about American education that there's no problem that we have that isn't being solved somewhere. Bill Clinton used to say there's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America. I would argue there's nothing wrong in public education that can't be fixed by what's right in public education. I think about a place like BAR, Building Assets and Reducing Risks. It's a program that was started by a school counselor in Minnesota who realized that many of the students in her school, particularly low-income students, students of color, immigrant students, weren't graduating at the same rate. She went to her principal and she said, you know what I'd like to do is I'd like to put more supports in place for those students. I'd like to have time, dedicated planning time, where teachers and counselors can meet about each of those students who are struggling and help them create a plan so that they make it through to graduation. She implemented this strategy, just changed the school schedule. Academics improved, graduation rates improved in the school, so much so that she came to the U.S. Education Department for an Investing in Innovation grant to scale up this effort across multiple schools. She went and scaled it up across multiple schools. In a randomized controlled trial, was able to demonstrate same kids, same teachers, different results because of organizing time differently. She came back for another I3 grant to scale the program up. It's now operating in more than 9 states across the country. One school counselor's idea about how to better leverage the adult community in support of kids. And I think about the work of PTEC. Maura Banta is here from IBM, and I think about the work that she and others have done at IBM on the PTEC schools. The PTEC schools started with a first school in Brooklyn, which was a turnaround school. Students at PTEC graduate with a high school diploma and an associate's degree, first in line for a job at IBM. PTEC is now being replicated across New York State in 16 different places or more, and it's also being replicated in Connecticut and Illinois, and many other states are bringing online PTEC schools, including Maryland. Right, so those are examples of places that are getting it right for kids. The question for us is, how do we do more of that more quickly? Jeremy talked about ESSA and the opportunity ESSA presents. There's both good news and bad news there. The good news is states are seizing the opportunity through ESSA to broaden the definition of educational excellence. I'm encouraged that states in this room are going to take a hard look at chronic absenteeism, because we know that kids who miss more than 10% of the school year are more likely to be retained in grade, more likely to drop out, more likely to get in trouble. Paying attention to who's chronically absent and intervening so that those kids are in the classroom, that will make a powerful difference. I'm encouraged that states are going to take a hard look at access to advanced coursework. Who's in advanced placement and international baccalaureate classes? Who's getting access to dual enrollment early college opportunities? We've done work at the Education Trust showing that if African American and Latino students and low-income students were in AP classes in their own schools, in numbers proportional to their representation in those schools, there'd be 640,000 more African American, Latino, and low-income students in AP classes. Right? We know there's inequity between schools. We know from the Civil Rights Data Collection that schools with large numbers of low-income students and students of color are less likely to have AP and IB classes, less likely to have even chemistry and physics and algebra 2. But what we found at EdTrust is even when those courses are present in a school, low-income students and students of color are underrepresented. States that are looking hard at advanced coursework through ESSA will be able to make, I think, a meaningful difference in expanding opportunity. States are taking advantage of the ESSA opportunity to broaden the definition of educational excellence beyond just English, math, and graduation. We know in too many places around the country, partly driven by NCLB, folks narrowed the curriculum. They said, you know, we want to improve English and math performance, so we will do less science and social studies. It's exactly backwards. If we want stronger readers, we have to make sure that kids have the kind of knowledge that is gained through science and social studies. So I'm encouraged that states are going to look at that through ESSA. Some states are going to include science and social studies in their accountability systems. I'm also encouraged that states are going to look at post-secondary indicators. We know some communities represented in this room have 80 to 90% of entering first-year college students taking remedial courses. And that's really just a euphemism for high school, but you pay college prices. Right? But states are now going to look at post-secondary success as a way of thinking about how to strengthen their high schools. How well are high schools preparing students for credit-bearing coursework? How well are high schools preparing students to persist in college? So I'm encouraged by that work that folks in this room have done on ESSA. But there is a dark cloud. I do worry about states that will allow averages to mask underperformance of groups of students within schools. In every state represented in this room, there is a school that if you looked at their average performance, they look fine. But if you looked at the performance of groups of students, English learners, students with disabilities, low-income students, African American or Latino students, you would see significant achievement gaps. And so we worry, will states step up to the ESSA opportunity to ensure that implementation of the law actually advances education equity, which is the promise of the law and of the original Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. So, what should we all be doing? What should we be thinking about? What should we be worried about? I want to suggest 4 areas that I hope folks in this room will focus on. Knowing that sadly today we still give the kids who need the most the least. That is, low-income students and students of color get less access to quality pre-K, less access to effective teachers, less access to advanced coursework, less access to school counselors. We found in the Civil Rights Data Collection survey at the Education Department, there are 1.6 million students who go to a school where there's a sworn law enforcement officer and no school counselor. Right, so we know that we're giving the kids who need the most the least, but what can we do about it? 4 things I think we should be focused on. One is, we know the return on investment of early learning is incredibly high, if it's high quality. 8 to 1, 9 to 1 return on investment. Better academic outcomes in K through 12, more likelihood of going on to college, more likelihood of being employed, better long-term health outcomes from high quality early learning. Every state in this room should be working towards the goal of making sure that every 3-year-old and 4-year-old has access to high-quality early learning. And that includes investing in the teacher workforce of early learning. We found at the Education Department that in many states, you could double your salary going from teaching pre-K to teaching kindergarten in a school district. That's a problem. We found in some states you could make more doing nails than you could make teaching pre-K. That's a problem. So we should all be focused on trying to expand access to quality early learning, which means academically rich early learning, play-based curricula. It means focusing on socio-emotional learning in those pre-K 3 and pre-K 4 classrooms. Second thing we should be focused on is making sure that school is a place that inspires and engages. I'm only standing here today. Folks who know me know this. I'm only standing here today because I had amazing New York City public school teachers who made school a place that was safe and interesting and compelling. My mom passed away when I was 8. My dad when I was 12. The thing that saved my life was having great New York City teachers. I was doing things like productions of Midsummer Night's Dream in elementary school, Alice in Wonderland. I always tell folks I was the Rose in Alice in Wonderland. Imagine with big red felt petals sticking out of my head. But I remember those moments in elementary school like it was yesterday because I had teachers who made school a place where I could be a kid when I couldn't be a kid outside of school. That's what we have to do. We have to always keep our focus on schools, on the core interaction between students and teachers. I'm thrilled that we have Teachers of the Year in the room. I'm thrilled that we have colleagues from Teach Plus in the room, folks who are focused on great teaching, because the essence of the learning experience in schools is great teaching that equips students with skills, but more importantly, inspires them about learning. That also means we've got to be vigilant about access to well-rounded education for all kids, science, social studies, the arts. And we've got to be smart about the use of technology. There are lots of folks who are probably in this room who are opening their mailbox each day to various flyers and letters and postcards from companies promising you that if only you buy their technology, all will be solved. Right? But we know in too many places technology is just the same worksheet on a screen. But it doesn't have to be that way. I think about visiting a classroom in central New York where kids were in an anatomy class. They were studying anatomy. They were watching a live knee surgery taking place in Ohio. They're in central New York. They're watching a live knee surgery in Ohio, narrated by the surgeon. It was quite gross. Narrated by the surgeon. When the surgeon completes the surgery, he then sits with students from all over the country in a virtual debrief of the operation. Right? That's using technology to make a learning experience possible that wouldn't have been possible without technology, not just a worksheet on a screen. So school being an inspiring and engaging place with a well-rounded curriculum is the second thing. The third thing is diversity. You're going to have a conversation later about the growing diversity in our society. A majority of the kids in our nation's schools today are kids of color. And yet, in many places around the country, schools are more segregated today than they were 10 or 20 years ago. It doesn't have to be that way. The Century Foundation has done an excellent report on 100 places around the country that are being thoughtful about creating intentionally diverse schools. We know that low-income students have the opportunity to go to socioeconomically diverse schools, do better academically, and affluent students do no worse because of their presence. We also know that all of our kids are going to inhabit a diverse higher ed world if they go on to higher education, a diverse workforce when they go on to the workforce, and they're going to be citizens in a diverse society. We owe it to them to prepare them for that diversity. We also know that even though a majority of the kids in our nation's public schools are kids of color, only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Our work on diversity has to extend beyond just students to asking how do we ensure a diverse educator workforce. And at Trust, we've done a significant amount of research on the importance of retention and making sure that we not only recruit teachers of color, but retain them. The last of the four things I wanted to mention is around extending beyond just school. There's a lot that can be done in school to make a difference in kids' lives. As I said, I'm only here today. I'm only alive today because of the difference school made for me. But we'd be kidding ourselves if we thought schools were going to solve all of society's problems. Schools have to work in conjunction with the community. I think about a study that was done at Johns Hopkins recently on vision. It was a fascinating, groundbreaking study. They had studied classrooms and they found that if kids cannot read the book or see the board, they do less well in school. A shocking finding, I know. They also found that if you get kids good vision care and they can read the book and see the board, wait for it, kids do better in school. Right? To acknowledge that kids who can't see the board or read the book need vision care isn't to discount the importance of great teaching or great school leadership or the role of schools. It's to acknowledge that kids are whole people, families are whole people, and we need to think about how the community works in conjunction with schools. We need to think about wraparound services. We need to think about access to health care and mental health services. We've got to think about housing policy as part of education policy. And it's one of the reasons in the Obama administration we invested in the Promised Neighborhoods program, to think about how do you bring everyone in the community together for the sake of kids. So early learning, schools that are engaging, inspiring, and provide a well-rounded, rich curriculum, genuine diversity, and an understanding that schools must work in conjunction with communities. All of that takes investment. What Jeremy said about increased investment in public education is encouraging, but there is much, much more to do in states. But ultimately, and this is where I'll end, this work is about leadership. It is about leadership that is focused on the needs of kids every day. It's about leadership that sees the hope in every child, that asks for every child, what would I want for my own? Whatever I would want for my own kid, I want for that kid. I feel so blessed as a parent to have my kids in great public schools in Montgomery County, Maryland, schools that are socioeconomically and racially diverse and that provide them with a rich, diverse curriculum. My younger daughter is in a STEM magnet. My older daughter is in a communication arts magnet. I feel very blessed. But I also know, as Dr. Martin Luther King would say, my kids will never be who they ought to be unless all kids, the kids in the poorest school in D.C., the most challenged school in Baltimore, the most struggling rural school in West Virginia, my kids will never be who they ought to be until those kids are who they ought to be. And that is our collective challenge, to have the leadership to ask the equity question first. Not create the policy and then say, oh yeah, what about English learners? What about students with disabilities? What about low-income kids? What about high-needs rural? But to start there, start with policies designed to advance opportunity for those who are most vulnerable and build from there. Right? That's our collective responsibility. And because I know you will lead in that way, I am grateful to you for what you do. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for those kind words and for kind of a really big picture idea of what are 4 of those kind of policies that we as education policymakers should be thinking about in the coming weeks, months, and even leading up to our next legislative sessions. Our next national thought leader is Michelle Weise, and she's the Senior Vice President of Workforce Strategies and Chief Innovation Officer for Strada Education Network. Prior to her work with Strada, Michelle was a Senior Research Fellow for Higher Education at the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation, a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. Dr. Weise is here today to discuss the critical connection between education and employment outcomes. Please join me in welcoming Michelle to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me here. Thanks to all the folks at ECS who've done so much work in preparing this. I wanted to, in a former life, I was an English professor, and one of the most sort of formative moments that kind of led to that pathway originally was when I was in college. And when we actually had this opportunity to listen to the novelist John Updike come and speak at our college, and someone in the audience asked him how he actually begins writing a novel. And to me, the answer that he gave was so simple and, to me, perfect. He said, you can't begin to write unless you have the end in mind. You have to know how the story is going to end. And I love this line because it helps me sort of translate some of the conundrums we face, especially when it comes to post-secondary education, which is this notion that often we focus a whole lot on getting students in. We don't often do as great a job as getting them through and out. And what I mean by this is you'll often hear academic leaders and faculty members say things like, well, we shouldn't be preparing students for their first job. We should be preparing them for their 5th job or their 10th job, a lifelong career. We don't need to worry about that first job. We're teaching them to learn how to learn for a lifetime. And what is challenging about this kind of response is that it actually turns out that the first job is really critical. I want to just sort of share with you a bunch of the research that I've been privileged to be a part of. And most recently, we came out with this report on underemployment. You'll often hear these narratives, right, of these newly minted college grads going on to maybe be a barista just for a few months or a few years while they find their footing, or they're just going to go sell clothes at the Gap or maybe take that job at, that Target retailer. It's just a moment of drift on the pathway to a long-term career. What we actually did in this research is that we took a look at 4 million unique resumes across a longitudinal time period of 10 years. And what we found is that in that sample of 4 million unique resumes, 43% of that sample started off underemployed. And if you started off underemployed, you were 5 times more likely to stay underemployed 5 years out. 75% of that group remained underemployed 10 years out. So this means that they were not leveraging the credential that they had achieved, in this case a bachelor's degree, into their work. So it turns out that underemployment is not a short-term problem, it is a long-term problem. What was even more startling about this data is that for some reason, women are worse off. As opposed to almost 1 out of 3 men starting off underemployed, 1 out of 2 women would start off underemployed. And what was equally disturbing was that in certain cases with men, it helped if you had majored in a discipline like computer science, engineering, communications. These sorts of majors actually helped you escape the rut of underemployment a little bit more quickly. For women, it didn't matter what you majored in, with the exception of engineering, where with engineering, male and female graduates were equally less likely to be underemployed. But across the board, for most other majors, women were facing a larger hill to climb. Turns out also that this underemployment piece, that first job that we tend to not want to think about for our students, has long-term financial implications. On average, most underemployed workers are earning $10,000 less per year, on average. And if you think about how that accumulates over time, and even compounds over time, when you think about the lack of access to social capital networks and the kinds of experiences that they should be having in order to build that career, the costs are substantial. So it turns out that we do need to think very critically about that first job. We can't just sort of put it off and leave the ending to someone else. And this gets me to a core part of the theory of disruptive innovation that I just wanted to share with you. It's too difficult to kind of go into the nitty-gritty of disruption. But one of the core parts of it that I love is this notion of the job to be done. And it's a very simple premise. It's this notion of why do we actually buy products and services in our lives? We think we are buying products and services, but actually what it is that we're hiring them to do a job in our lives. So the way to think about this is the great marketing professor Theodore Levitt once said, people don't want a 1/4-inch drill, they want a 1/4-inch hole. So we often hire a drill to do that job in our lives. And we have to think about what is it that students are hiring higher education in their lives for, right? There's kind of an interesting corollary with the newspaper industry in the sense that we used to actually hire a newspaper to do multiple jobs in our lives. We used to hire it to help us get a broad-based understanding of the world. We used to hire it to help us find a mate or help us find real estate. We used to hire it to keep us from getting bored, which is why we did the crossword puzzle maybe. one by one, job by job, piece by piece, those value propositions were undercut by providers who singled out a singular value proposition and homed in on it completely. These were places like CNN.com, blogs, apps, LinkedIn, Craigslist, Monster.com. We have to begin to think in higher education, are we maybe trying to perform too many jobs for too many people? Why is that person hiring a state comprehensive university over a community college? What is the job that is different that a private liberal arts college does versus a community college? Are we trying to do too many things for too many different people? Because what is becoming clear in our research is that we've been actually interviewing over the last 2 years, over 250,000 people with Gallup, 350 Americans every single day, aged 18 to 65. And the reason that they tell us that they hire higher education in their lives is for career and work outcomes. Double more than any other motivation out there, the reason why they pursue higher education is for getting a good job. And the question is, are we delivering? And the answer is no. In that same survey of our currently enrolled students, only 36% feel prepared for the workforce. Only 40% of our liberal arts majors actually believe that their major will lead to a good job. So we have to become cognizant of this notion of what is it that we are hired to do in their lives, and are we actually delivering? There's a new job to be done that's really emerging in this new economy as we think about the growing narratives around the labor market, right? The skills gap, wage stagnation, underemployment, unemployment. We have a new job to be done that adult learners in particular, and this is the non-traditional student, and over 70% of our college-going population displays one non-traditional characteristic in their lives. These are people who are working part-time or full-time. They have families. They are tied to a geographical region. They have a lot of things that get in the way of their pursuit of a degree. And what they are seeking often are cost-effective, targeted, briefer learning pathways that move them ahead in their working lives, that help them translate what they know into what they can do in the workforce. And more college or more graduate school is not going to necessarily be the answer for these people. And what you see is that as colleges begin to try to home in on their competitive advantage, they tend to look at their peer institutions or institutions within their Carnegie ranking or sort of the level and tier that they work in as their competitive set. Meanwhile, we have this new emergence of marginal learning providers seeming to kind of bubble up in the margins. And these are folks that are homing in on that direct pathway from education to employment. They are trying to connect students more directly to employment pathways. And many institutions are looking at these providers and thinking, that doesn't mean anything, or that coding boot camp, coding boot camps seem to be shuttering. It's not going to last for very long. It doesn't really impact what we do in our day-to-day jobs. It's not of the same quality. But these folks are actually homing in on very different kinds of value propositions where they can say to a student, come to me and spend only $6,000 to $12,000 to $20,000 and come out in a few months with something that means something to an employer, where they will hire you and pay you 6 figures to do a really interesting job at that cutting-edge company. That's a better set of odds than if I were to actually go into law school, where my odds of actually getting a job and spending the money to get a JD are about 57% at this point, according to the American Bar Association. So as much as we might want to dismiss these kinds of entrants, these kinds of folks are working on a different job to be done of connecting learning to know and learning to do. And this is especially important as we think about what lies ahead. There are a lot of projections out there today about the job market, the future of work, right? Deloitte has projected a few years ago that 50% of an undergraduate degree is going to become obsolete within a few years. Over at Oxford Martin Program for the Impacts of Future Technology, they have this interesting idea that 47% of total employment in the US is at risk of automation or computerization. McKinsey thinks that half of the activities that are affiliated with $15 trillion of wages in the global economy are at risk of job obsolescence. This is massive job obsolescence we are talking about. And we have to remember that despite our low unemployment rate, what that doesn't capture is the tremendous growth in our contingent workforce. So much of the growth in jobs is happening in part-time labor. McKinsey analysts think that part-time labor is higher than at any point since 1980. So we have a growing number of Americans who are stitching together part-time jobs to make ends meet. Then you try to marry this with this notion of all the kinds of exponential futures that we're starting to really feel the velocity of change. And what I mean by this is there's often this, Moore's law is often kind of touted as, okay, well, we see the rate of computing power doubling every 2 years. And we see this happening in really unique ways. Since the 1890s, there's been a trillion-fold increase in computing power. A billion-fold of that has just happened since the creation of mainframe computers. At the same time, the cost of these technologies start to fall, and you see faster and more market penetration. So if you think about it, today, the global population, 76% of the global population has access to a cell phone. It took 76 years in the US for the landline to make its way into households, into half of the households in America. 76 years. The cell phone did it in less than 10. PricewaterhouseCoopers has this other notion that in 2001, it used to cost about $96 million to sequence a human genome. By 2013, the cost had gone down to $6,000. Today, any of us can go online and buy a 23andMe kit and do that same kind of genetic sequencing ourselves. So this is what people talk about when they talk about exponential futures, and they are really no joke, right? At the same time, you have futurists and experts on aging and longevity talking about how the first humans to live to be 150 years old have already been born. Think about that. Are we going to have 100-year work lives? It just sort of seems unfathomable, right? Here's what this means. We are going to have to start preparing students for jobs that do not exist. It's already begun to happen. If you look back to 2014, the hottest jobs on LinkedIn were jobs that didn't exist 5 or 10 years prior. These were things like iOS or Android developer, UI UX designer, social media intern, big data architect, cloud manager. How many jobs that do not exist yet will a person have during a 150-year lifespan? Do we really believe that 2, 4, or 6 years of learning on the front end of a 100-year work life will sustain ourselves? We have to begin understanding that this future of work has really something for us to think about as we think about where we are today as higher education 2018. We can't just simply extrapolate from where we are today to meet the workforce of 2030 or 2040. Something is going to have to give. And the challenge is that as we think about these kinds of prospects of doom and gloom, we tend to get quite negative and we tend to despair. What you'll often find is that when you are in, and I'm sure many of you have been in this situation, when you are in a situation where you're trying to create an innovative solution to what you are seeing as changes in the landscape, you will often find someone trying to kill that new idea. It turns out that this is our brains actually working against us. Our brains are actually hardwired to perceive newness and change just as though we're perceiving a tiger in the bush. It heightens our amygdala, it goes on heightened alert, and it triggers our fight or flight response in that same exact way that we used to respond as Neanderthals. What happens is that it actually prevents our prefrontal cortex from combating all of our biases towards negativity. And that's the reason why we often feel ourselves in that kind of defensive posture and wanting to kind of squash that new idea. And it's hard because we can't just sort of say, hey, well, let's just be better about orienting towards the future. And let's just maybe try to think 10 years out how we can move towards that goal. Turns out our brain works against us in this way as well, where our medial prefrontal cortex almost kind of just dims down. What this means is that if we try to actually project our own selves 10 years out from now, we have the same exact neural patterns as though we are looking at a complete stranger. There's no empathy, no emotional connection to that person, even though it's us. It's one of the reasons why we are so terrible at making good choices about food, about drinking, about smoking, about financial planning. It's hard to care about that future person, even though it's ourselves. They seem like a complete stranger to us. So what do we do? How do we think bigger? What kinds of tools and skill sets can we use to orient better towards the future? One of my favorite quotes is by the futurist at University of Hawaii, Manoa, named Jim Dater, and he says, any useful statement about the future should at first seem ridiculous. And I want to encourage all of you to use this as sort of your standard bearer. Is this notion that I am talking about today ridiculous? Because if you think about what we live in today, if we had said to people 7 years ago, hey, I'm going to go, actually probably maybe now 8 years ago, if we had said, hey, I'm going to go into a stranger's car, not really pay them, get to the airport, that's how I'm going to move about the world, it would have sounded ridiculous. But today, these things are our new reality. And as we think about the future of higher education, and as we think about those expansive work lives and how turbulent they are going to be given our exponential futures, we are going to have to project that students, that adult learners, adult workers in particular, are going to have to move seamlessly, much more seamlessly, in and out of learning and work. The way I like to think about this is right now, as we think about higher education, we do not offer many on or off ramps. When someone actually opts onto that off-ramp, we call them a college dropout. We stigmatize them. And then we saddle them with student loan debt, making it harder for them to return. And we wonder why they're not motivated to come back and finish, right? We don't offer many on or off ramps in and out of learning and work. We don't have ways, we don't have actually mechanisms for people to pay for different alternative pathways beyond what is covered in their tuition reimbursement dollars. We have to start thinking much more transformatively about how we imagine this future learning ecosystem where people are going to need to understand, where am I today? What are the competencies, the skill sets that I have today that I can leverage into a new sector or a new industry in case my job becomes obsolete? Or how do I better coordinate with those robots? How do I actually learn the skills that I need in order to transfer my skills as a truck driver into one of those remote operators? There are lots of ways in which we need to start being much more creative about how we get students in, through, and out, and back in, through, and out, over and over again, repeatedly throughout their working lives. We give so much lip service to this notion of lifelong learning, but we do very little to actually build the infrastructure, to seed investments in the foundational architecture, the systems, the infrastructure needed to facilitate this seamless movement in and out of learning and work. We are going to have to imagine that the future of education will ultimately involve much more consumer insights. There will be verified reviews of that nanodegree program or that X series program or that boot camp or that major at that university. We are going to see much more transparency in what is right now an unnecessary black box of education. It's unnecessarily opaque. And I think that we are at this critical juncture where we can stop talking about the problem, we can stop admiring the problem, and we can begin to build. Thank you.